The sun was a merciless orb of brass, bleaching the color from the vast Arizona sky and baking the adobe walls of the solitary cantina into cracked, dusty tiles. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of cheap tobacco, cheaper whiskey, and the sweat of men who had long since surrendered to the desert's grim arithmetic. At a corner table, away from the listless flies buzzing over an unfinished plate of beans, sat Eli. His face, weathered beyond its years by sun and solitude, was a mask of grim resignation. His calloused fingers, usually so steady when holding a deck of cards or the reins of a horse, trembled slightly around a nearly empty glass. The debt was a physical weight in his chest, a cold stone of dread that had been growing for months. It belonged to Silas Thorne, a man whose wealth was matched only by the cruelty he wore as comfortably as his tailored waistcoat. Thorne was not a man to be reasoned with. He was a force of nature, like a flash flood in a canyon, inescapable and utterly destructive. Eli's attempts to outrun this fate had been pathetic, laughable even. A failed cattle drive where half the herd was lost to a sudden inexplicable stampede. A silver claim that had yielded little more than pretty rocks and blistered hands. Every door he tried had slammed shut, as if the very landscape conspired with Thorne to corner him. And now, the final reckoning had come. Thorne's men, two hulking brutes with the dead eyes of rattlesnakes, had found him here. They did not need to speak. Their presence was the message. Eli drained the last bitter dregs from his glass and stood, his chair scraping against the rough wooden floor like a death rattle. The walk to Thorne's office, located above the town's only bank, was the longest of his life. The bustling street, with its blacksmiths and merchants and chattering children, seemed to exist in another world, a world from which he was now permanently exiled. Silas Thorne's office was an island of oppressive luxury in a sea of dust. Persian rugs, worn thin in paths between door and desk, muffled Eli's footsteps. Glass-fronted cabinets held geological specimens and artifacts that looked plundered from ancient graves. Thorne himself sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers steepled. He did not offer Eli a seat. The proposal was delivered not as a suggestion, but as a verdict. The debt would be erased completely, irrevocably. The price? A marriage. A union with a woman from the Koya tribe, the people of a stone, who inhabited the high, mesquite-choked mesas to the north. Thorne needed their land. A geological survey, conducted in secret, had revealed a vein of silver so rich it would dwarf all his other holdings combined. But the Koya were obstinate, their connection to the land spiritual, not financial. They would never sell, never negotiate. But an ancient, nearly forgotten clause in a dusty treaty, leveraged by Thorne's team of slick lawyers, stated that a marriage bond between a settler and a tribe person would grant the settler familial rights to the land. Thorne needed a groom, a puppet, a man with no other options. Eli felt the last shreds of his pride wither and die. He pictured a sullen, broad-faced woman, smelling of smoke and animal fat, her eyes filled with either fear or contempt. He saw a life of silent, shared misery in some remote shack, a permanent prisoner to this arrangement. But the alternative was a shallow grave in the desert, a fate Thorne's smiling eyes promised without words. With a soul-deep numbness that was worse than any pain, Eli gave a single, sharp nod. The ceremony was a hollow pantomime. It took place at the edge of the Koya lands, under a skeletal juniper tree. A Koya elder, his face a road map of wrinkles, chanted in a low, guttural tongue. Eli barely listened. His focus was on the woman standing beside him. She was smaller than he had imagined, shrouded in a heavy, undyed wool blanket. It had pulled up to shadow her face. All he could see was the faint line of her jaw and the quiet, still way she held herself. There was no resistance, no emotion. She was a statue. When it was over, Thorne presented them with a marriage certificate, his smile a predator's grimace. Eli took the reins of the single old mule Thorne had provided, upon which his new wife sat, and turned his back on the gathering. He led them towards the dilapidated shack he called home, a place that now felt less like a refuge and more like a prison cell that had just acquired a second occupant. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, a dry, mocking sound. The shack was exactly as he had left it, perhaps a little dustier. It consisted of a single room with a packed earth floor, a stone fireplace blackened by decades of soot, a rough-hewn table, and a single cot in the corner. Eli dropped his saddlebags by the door with a thud, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. He pointed a grimy finger towards the cot. "You can have that," he muttered, the first words he had spoken to her. He then turned his back, busying himself with unpacking his meager possessions, a performance of normalcy that fooled no one. She did not respond. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched her. She moved with a silent, fluid grace that was unnerving. She did not immediately go to the cot. Instead, she stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, her head tilted as if listening to something he could not hear. Then, she slowly pushed back the hood of her blanket. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He had expected coarse features, a face hardened by a harsh life. He was not prepared for the young woman who was revealed. Her hair was not the coarse black he imagined, but a cascade of dark, deep brown, falling in waves around her shoulders. Her skin was the color of warm honey, and her face was not broad, but elegantly sculpted, with high cheekbones and a strong, straight nose. But it was her eyes that held him, that shattered his preconceptions. They were a startling shade of hazel, almost gold in the dim light, and they held no fear, no submission, no anger. They were pools of ancient, unreadable calm. She looked at him, through him, as if assessing his very soul, and then her gaze swept the room, taking in the poverty, the grime, the loneliness. A faint, almost imperceptible frown touched her lips. It was not a frown of disappointment, but of analysis. Without a word, she set to work. She took the blanket from her shoulders, folded it with a ritualistic precision, and placed it on the foot of the cot. From a small woven bag she carried, she produced a few personal items: a smooth, dark river stone, a bundle of dried herbs that released a faint, clean scent into the stale air, and a small, beautifully crafted clay pot. Eli watched, mesmerized and unsettled. He had prepared himself for sullen resistance or weeping hysteria. This quiet, purposeful competence was far more disquieting. He had expected a burden, a child to be managed. He was faced with a mystery. That first night, he laid out his bedroll on the hard floor near the fireplace, putting as much distance between them as the small room allowed. Sleep was a long time coming. He listened to the soft, even sound of her breathing from the cot, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the gentle sigh of the wind outside. He was acutely aware of another presence in his space, a presence that felt both intrusively alien and strangely deeply rooted. He felt like the stranger here, not her. The following days fell into a strained, silent rhythm. Eli would rise at dawn and go through the motions of his old life, checking the perimeter of his small, failed plot of land, tending to his single, aging horse, mending a fence that served no purpose. He was playing a part, the part of Eli the rancher, but the performance felt hollow. His real occupation was that of a jailer, and he was prisoner in his own jail. His wife, whose name he still did not know, began to change the space. She never asked for permission. One morning, she gathered wild grasses and wove them into a tight, efficient broom and swept the hard-packed floor until it was smooth and clean. She collected specific plants from the desert, yucca, sage, juniper berries, and arranged them in small bundles that filled the room with their sharp, purifying aroma. She took the single pot he owned and scrubbed it with sand and water until the metal shone. She was not making a home. She was consecrating a space, imposing a new and unfamiliar order upon his chaos. Eli would watch her from the doorway, a knot of conflicting emotions in his chest. There was resentment, yes, for this invasion, but there was also a growing, grudging fascination. She moved through the harsh landscape not as a conqueror, but as a part of it. She never stumbled on the loose shale, never started at the sudden scuttle of a lizard. She seemed to listen to the desert, and it, in turn, seemed to speak to her. One evening, he came back from a long, pointless walk to find she had built a small, perfect fire in the hearth. A simple stew of beans and the wild onions she had gathered simmered in the pot. She had placed a wooden bowl for him on the table. It was not an offering of peace, nor a wifely duty. It was a simple, practical act, an acknowledgement of their shared, basic need for sustenance. He ate in silence, the food tasting richer, more complex than anything he had ever cooked for himself. The silence between them was no longer just empty space. It was beginning to fill with something unnameable, something that was not yet understanding, but was no longer pure hostility. The wall was still there, but its foundations were beginning to shift. A week into their silent cohabitation, a change occurred. It began subtly. Eli noticed that the quality of the silence in the shack had shifted. It was no longer a void of mutual disregard, but a tense, watchful quiet, as if the very air was holding its breath. He started to notice things when he ventured to the sparse, dusty town for supplies. A man, too well dressed for a miner, leaning against a post outside the general store, whittling a stick with a long, sharp knife. Another, his face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat, seemingly asleep on a bench, but whose eyes tracked Eli's movements with a reptilian stillness. They were Thorne's men. The message was clear. The marriage was not the end of Thorne's interest. It was merely the beginning. Eli was on a leash, and Thorne was holding it, waiting to see if his new dog would perform its trick and secure the land. This surveillance extended to his wife. Eli began to notice her stillness at certain times of the day. She would stand by the single grimy window, her body poised like a deer that has caught a predator's scent. Her eyes, those calm, golden pools, would grow sharp, focused on a distant ridge or a particular clump of juniper. She knew she was being watched. This shared sense of being hunted created a fragile, unspoken bond. They were captives of the same jailer. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name, Eli decided to follow her. She had begun a new ritual, slipping out of the shack in the deep indigo hours just after sunset. Tonight, as she ghosted through the twilight, a shadow among shadows, he moved after her, his cowboy boots making soft, crunching sounds on the gravel that sounded deafening to his ears compared to her silent passage. She led him on a winding path up into the broken foothills, through arroyos and across stone shelves that were invisible until you were upon them. She moved with an uncanny certainty, as if following a road only she could see. After nearly an hour, she stopped at the edge of a small, hidden clearing. Eli crouched behind a large, weathered boulder, his heart pounding. In the clearing, illuminated by the faint starlight, was a Koya elder, a man Eli recognized from the wedding. He was kneeling, his hands raised to the emerging stars, chanting a low, rhythmic prayer. The scene was one of profound peace. Then the peace shattered. 3 figures emerged from the opposite tree line. They were Thorne's men, the same ones he'd seen in town. They carried no rifles, but one held a coiled whip, another a heavy club. They moved with the casual cruelty of men who knew they were the law in this lawless place. The elder rose slowly, facing them without fear, but with a deep, weary sadness. This was a test, Eli realized. Thorne was pushing, probing the tribe's resolve, seeing how far he could go. Eli's hand went to the Colt peacemaker at his hip. His instincts, the instincts of a man who had lived by a simple code of frontier justice, screamed at him to intervene. But fear, cold and pragmatic, held him back. It was 3 against 1. It was suicide. He was frozen, a spectator to an impending atrocity. As the lead thug raised his club, Eli's wife, Ayanna, for he finally thought of her by the name he'd heard the elder use at the wedding, stepped out of the shadows. She did not run. She did not scream. She simply stood at the edge of the clearing, her feet planted firmly on the earth. She raised her hands, not in supplication, but as if reaching for the sky. Her lips began to move, forming silent, intricate words. For a moment, nothing happened. The thugs laughed, a harsh, ugly sound in the sacred quiet. Then the wind died, completely. The gentle rustle of the juniper needles ceased, leaving an absolute, terrifying silence. A moment later, a gust of wind, hot and gritty, blasted through the clearing, not from one direction, but from all around, spinning into a localized vortex. It lifted dust and sand and dry leaves, creating a stinging, blinding cloud that enveloped the 3 men. They cried out, clawing at their eyes, stumbling blindly. In the confusion, the elder melted back into the darkness. Ayana lowered her hands. The mini whirlwind dissipated as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving the three men coughing, disoriented and terrified. They fled back the way they had come, their bravado utterly shattered. Eli remained behind his boulder, his body trembling not with fear, but with a profound, earth-shattering awe. He had not married a simple native woman. He had married something else entirely, a force of nature given human form. The world he knew, a world of six-shooters and steel rails and written deeds, had just cracked open, revealing something ancient, powerful, and terrifyingly real beneath. The walk back to the shack was different. Eli did not try to conceal his presence. The pretense was over. She knew he had followed, and he knew that she knew. They walked separately, but for the first time, they walked together. The silence that stretched between them was no longer a wall, but a bridge, fragile and new, built on the shared foundation of what he had witnessed. When they arrived back at the shack, the first sliver of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. Eli did not retreat to his bedroll. He stood by the cold fireplace, watching as Ayana stirred the embers back to life with a quiet, practiced efficiency. She did not look at him with accusation or triumph. Her expression was one of acceptance, as if a necessary threshold had been crossed. He finally spoke, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. What was that? It was not an accusation, but a genuine, awestruck question. She looked at him then, her golden eyes reflecting the growing flames. She did not answer with words, not at first. Instead, she knelt on the floor and, with her finger, began to draw in the thin layer of ash and dust by the hearth. She drew a circle. Then, within the circle, she drew a series of interconnected lines, a river, a mountain, a stand of trees. She placed a small, smooth stone from her pouch at the mountain's peak. She pointed to the stone, then to her own heart. Then she pointed to the drawing of the river and made a flowing motion with her hand. She pointed to the wind outside, and then to her own lips. The meaning was slow to dawn on him, but when it did, it was revelatory. The land was not a thing. It was not property. It was a living, breathing entity. And she was not just a woman of the Koya. She was a part of its consciousness, a voice for its spirit. She was a shaman, a bridge between the physical world and the animating force within it. Her purpose was not to dominate nature, but to listen to it, to maintain its balance. Thorn's digging, his desire to tear open the mountain's heart for silver, was not just trespass. It was a sacrilege, a violent assault on a living being. And it was waking something up, something that had slept for eons. This was the beginning of her teachings. They developed their own language, a pigeon of gestured words, drawn symbols, and shared looks. She taught him to see the desert not as a barren wasteland to be endured, but as a complex, pulsing web of life. She showed him how to find water by observing the flight of certain birds, how to read the coming weather in the shapes of the clouds and the behavior of the ants, how to identify plants that could heal and plants that could kill. She explained that the spirit of the mountain, which her people called Tava, the sunstone, was not a metaphor. It was a vast, slumbering intelligence, a guardian. Thorn's explosions were not just digging. They were jabbing a sleeping giant with a hot poker. The earth tremors they had started to feel, the strange, agitated behavior of the animals. These were not coincidences. They were warnings. Tava was stirring in its sleep, and its dreams were becoming nightmares. Eli, the pragmatic cowboy, found his worldview dismantled and rebuilt. The stories his own people told around campfires were of monsters and ghosts. Hers were of the consciousness of a stone, the memory of a river, the anger of a defiled mountain. And he had seen, with his own eyes, that her stories were true. He was no longer just a man trapped in a marriage of convenience. He was a student, an apprentice to a mystery. He was learning the grammar of a world he had never known existed. And with this knowledge came a terrible burden. He was now responsible for it too. The fight was no longer just about his debt or her people. It was about preventing a cataclysm. The warnings escalated from whispers to screams. Minor tremors became more frequent. strong enough to rattle the plates on the shelf and send puffs of dust drifting from the ceiling. A pack of coyotes, normally wary and nocturnal, descended upon a chicken coop in broad daylight, their eyes wild and frantic, not with hunger, but with a primal fear. Snakes, including venomous varieties never seen so close to human habitation, began to appear in the town streets and even on the porches of homes, slithering in a confused, agitated mass, as if fleeing some subterranean terror. The air grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on Eli's arms stand on end. The weather turned bizarre and violent. One day, the sun would beat down with a furious orange intensity. The next, the sky would unleash a torrential, flooding rain that washed out roads and turned arroyos into raging rivers. The natural world was out of joint, its rhythms broken. Silas Thorne, however, was a man who believed only in the reality he could blast, dig, or buy. He saw the strange phenomena not as omens, but as obstacles engineered by the superstitious savages to delay his progress. His greed had become a fever, blinding him to everything but the glittering promise of the silver vein. He decided on a show of force, a decisive strike that would end the resistance once and for all. He would decapitate the snake. He gathered every man in his employ, miners, guards, hired guns, a small army of perhaps 30 souls, armed with dynamite, Winchester rifles, and a cold-blooded determination. Their target was not the mountain itself, but the heart of the Koya village. Thorne's twisted logic had concluded that if he could destroy the spiritual center of the resistance, the mountain spirit, whatever it was, would submit. It was a declaration of war not just on a people, but on the land itself. From a high ridge overlooking the valley, Eli and Ayanna saw the column of dust raised by Thorne's men as they marched toward the mesa. The time for lessons was over. The time for hiding was past. Ayanna turned to Eli. In her eyes, he saw not a plea, but a question. It was the same question he had been asking himself since the night in the clearing. Who was he? Was he Eli, the broken cowboy, the indentured servant of Silas Thorne? Or was he Eli, the husband of Ayanna, the student of the land, the guardian of Tava? He looked at the advancing line of men, at the glint of their rifle barrels in the sun. He looked at Ayanna, standing firm against the sky, her connection to the trembling earth of physical aura around her. The choice was made not in that moment, but in all the moments that had led to it. In the silent meals, the shared vigilance, the awe of witnessing her power, the profound peace of understanding her world. He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cool and steady in his. It was the first time they had truly touched. The gesture was an answer. It was a pact. They would face this together. They would turn and run, not away from the fight, but towards it, taking a secret, ancient path known only to her to reach the village before Thorne's army. The final battle was coming, and they would be its epicenter. They arrived at the Koya village as the first echoes of gunfire shattered the afternoon calm. Thorne's men, fortified by whiskey and avarice, had opened fire on the outskirts, aiming to terrorize. The Koya warriors, armed with little more than hunting rifles, bows, and courage, were putting up a fierce but hopelessly outgunned resistance. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, dust, and fear. Thorne himself stood on a rocky outcrop, directing his men like a general, his face alight with a terrifying joy. This was the culmination of his life's work, the domination of a people and a land that had dared to defy him. Eli and Ayanna did not join the fray directly. They moved to the highest point of the village, a flat-top rock that the Koya called the Speaking Stone, a place where the veil between worlds was said to be thin. Below them, the battle raged. Ayanna closed her eyes, sinking into a deep trance. She began to chant, a low, resonant sound that seemed not to come from her throat, but from the earth beneath their feet. Eli stood before her, his Colt peacemaker in his hand. But he was not there to shoot men. He was her guardian, her protector, a lone sentinel, while she worked a magic far older than gunpowder. He saw a Thorne gunman take aim at an old woman fleeing with a child. Eli's shot rang out, not hitting the man, but striking the Winchester in his hands, splintering the stock and sending it flying from his grasp. The man stared at his empty, stinging hands in shock. Another man, closer, raised a dynamite bundle with a lit fuse. Eli's second shot was a blur, severing the fuse an inch from a stick. The dynamite fell, harmless. He was a surgeon of violence, using his skill not to kill, but to disarm, to disrupt, to protect. He was creating a space for her power to grow. And grow it did. As Ayana's chant rose in pitch and intensity, the mountain responded. The ground beneath their feet began to shake, not with a tremor, but with a deep groaning roar, as if a giant were awakening from 1,000-year slumber. Tava was awake. Fissures split the earth around Thorn's men, not wide enough to swallow them, but deep enough to halt their advance and send them stumbling back. From these fissures, a strange, glowing mist began to emanate, a vapor that carried the scent of ozone and ancient stone. It was not poisonous, but it induced a primal, mind-numbing terror. The wind, which Ayana had summoned once before in a small clearing, now rose into a gale, howling down from the mountain peaks. It did not touch the Koya or their dwellings, but it tore at Thorn's men, ripping hats from heads, blinding them with dust, turning their own gunfire into a chaotic, dangerous hazard. The sky, already bruised and strange, darkened further, and a cold rain began to fall, instantly turning the dust to a slick, clinging mud. The very environment had become a weapon, and it was utterly discriminating. Thorn's men, their courage broken by the supernatural assault, dropped their weapons and fled in a blind panic, scrambling over each other to escape the wrath of the mountain. Thorn was left alone on his outcrop, his empire of fear reduced to nothing. He stared, wild-eyed, at Eli and Ayana on the speaking stone. He saw the cowboy, not as a pawn, but as a warrior priest, standing guard over the woman who commanded the earth and sky. The reality of a world he could not control, a power he could not buy, finally broke him. He sank to his knees, his body racked with sobs of utter defeat. As suddenly as it began, the cataclysm ceased. The earth stilled. The wind died down to a whisper. The mist dissipated. The rain stopped, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the speaking stone. Ayana opened her eyes, exhausted but radiant. The silence that fell over the valley was profound, a silence of awe and rebirth. Eli holstered his pistol and turned to her. He took her hand again, and this time he pulled her into an embrace. It was not an embrace of passion, but of partnership, of shared victory, of a bond that had been forged in the crucible of a battle that had shaken the heavens and the earth. They looked out over the valley, their valley. The union that had begun as a transaction of greed had become the salvation of a land. They were no longer a cowboy and a Tuarenka. They were the guardians of the stone, their two hearts beating as one with the pulse of the earth they had sworn to protect. The story of what happened that day would be told and retold, a legend that forever changed the understanding of a land and the power of an unexpected, world-altering union.